collegato con noi da Bruxelles Antonio De Sousa Maia. Vediamo se la regia ci aiuta, noi non lo vediamo, eccolo qua. Salve, buonasera, buonasera. Allora, Antonio De Sousa Maia è, insomma, l'abbiamo detto, della direzione generale del mercato interno, dell'industria, dell'imprenditoria e delle piccole e medie imprese della Commissione europea. E noi con lei partiamo dalle sfide che abbiamo davanti, ovviamente però anche dai risultati ottenuti, come le istituzioni europee ci insegnano. La sostenibilità deve essere intesa con un approccio, diciamo, olistico che comprenda ambiente, società, finanza, energia, moda e molto altro. La centralità di questo mindset che ormai abbiamo tutti è anche un risultato, diciamo, delle politiche intraprese. Allora, siccome lei è molto esperto nell'aspetto regolatorio, ci potrà forse aiutare a capire qual è la strategia messa in campo dall'Unione Europea in materia di prodotti tessili e implementato soprattutto tenendo in considerazione quello che è la necessità di migliorare l'impatto ambientale e nel frattempo senza deteriorare, anzi incentivando la competitività. Nessuno può essere lasciato indietro, questo l'avete detto tante volte, l'obiettivo rimane quello del 2050, ma alcuni dei nostri panelist ci hanno detto che insomma gli obiettivi devono essere anche più vicini. E allora dove siamo? Che cosa si farà, che cosa ha già fatto, diciamo, la Commissione in materia proprio legislativa.
Hello, I think it's my turn. I'm sorry, my Italian is very rusty. Buongiorno. Sorry for not speaking Italian. Thank you for having me here. So, indeed, I will give you a short presentation on what the Commission is doing with a focus on the regulatory action, but I would also cover some other non-regulatory actions. So, could you go to the next slide, please? All right. So just to give you a quick context, at the time this commission came into office in 2019, immediately the Green Deal was adopted, and shortly thereafter there was the adoption of circular economy action plans, and a number of products were highlighted as in need of action to become circular and to become environmentally sustainable. Textiles, as you can see, was one of them. Next slide, please. I have quite a number of slides, but I'll go fast, I promise.
No problem.
Indeed, indeed, we noticed that for textiles, for which there was no specific legislation apart from a labeling regulation, we noticed that for textiles, the market was not functioning properly. We needed to intervene to make textile products more sustainable and more circular. The textile sector has the fourth largest impact on the environment, the third largest in water and land use. The rates of recycling were fiber-to-fiber recycling, which is the kind of recycling we want, so closed loop, was at 1%. And even total recycling, which includes downcycling, so making more expensive textile products into rags or insulation, was at 20-30%. So it was very, very limited. We needed really to intervene in regulatory terms. Next slide, please. So following the inclusion of textiles in the Circular Economy Action Plan, we adopted in May 2022, so 2 years ago already, a strategy, a textile strategy. And the idea there indeed is to make the textile products, to intervene in regulatory terms mostly, but also with other actions, to make textile products more durable, more repairable, more recyclable, made of recycled fibers and without hazardous substances. And there's a part on social rights that I will also cover. And at the same time, we want to boost reuse. We want to boost repair and make the economy of textiles really a circular economy by design. Next slide, please. So what are the key actions in regulatory terms for under the textile strategy to achieve this objective? So number one, and really the most important, is eco-design. The framework regulation was just adopted for a wide array of products, but we are now already preparing a delegated act to introduce the specific eco-design requirements for textiles. I don't know if you know, but what does eco-design aim to do? It aims to introduce two types of requirements, information and performance requirements. So information is really about telling everybody, so companies, authorities, and consumers, just how sustainable and circular products are under harmonized metrics, harmonized standards, harmonized conformity assessment methods. And then performance kicks in. So with this metric, we will have a performance scale, so just how sustainable and circular products are. And the idea of performance requirements is to require a minimum below which products will be banned from the internal market. So they cannot be placed on the market. And it's very important to stress, this being product legislation, it applies to all products. It doesn't matter where they're manufactured, as long as they are placed on the EU market. So it applies to products manufactured in Bangladesh, in China, wherever, as long as they're placed on the EU market. Also in eco design, we have some actions on unsold goods to avoid the destruction. It's also linked to trying to avoid overproduction and indirectly overconsumption, linked to
Vediamo se riusciamo.
information, but also a traceability tool, which is a digital product passport you may have heard about. At the same time, we are revising the one piece of legislation I told you we had on textiles, which is textile labeling regulation, not only to revise the current rules on how to determine fiber composition and explain it in a label, but also to harmonize other labeling domains such as origin, size, care instructions. We are exploring practically all types of labeling domains. Apart from this, we have REACH restrictions, some already adopted. So these are chemical restrictions on chemical substances. Some already adopted. It's the case of the intentionally added microplastics, some under consideration, skin sensitizers, and added restrictions on PFAS. PFAS are the forever chemicals. They're very, very persistent chemicals that are used in other industries also, but in textiles. At the same time, we have some pieces of legislation specifically directed at consumers. This being the case of green claims, we'll talk a bit more about that. We have specific legislation also super important on waste, how to properly manage textile waste. And we have in a global sustainability pillar, which also includes social issues, we have some legislation on due diligence and also banning forced labor products. So next slide. Just quickly to explain a bit how eco design and the label works. So as I told you, eco design is all about information and performance requirements. How do we define then sustainability and circularity? We have something called the eco design product aspects. So it's a closed list. It's in the eco design regulation. Essentially, for now, we're focusing on durability, recyclability, recycled content, but there are others like presence of chemicals, also very important, substances of concern, and also generation of waste, including microplastics. So these are really the main ones, but check the list. It's a closed list. At the same time, we are also aiming to revise eco label and green public procurement. Green public procurement to have a higher level of ambition, a higher minimum of performance for the contracting authorities purchasing textile products. Eco label as the mark of excellence, also in the same metric of eco design. Digital product passport I already talked about. The label, as you can see there, you have some examples. So not only a label, digital label on sustainability and circularity, meaning describing the eco design, the eco design characterization of the product, but also harmonizing, which doesn't mean make it mandatory. They can be voluntary, but harmonizing at EU level other labeling domains like origin, care, size, possibly allergenic substances. Leather and fur authenticity is another one that's actually asked by environmental organizations and industry alike. And as I also said, we also have a delegated act coming on unsold goods, which tries to avoid the destruction of products that are left unsold by economic operators. Next slide. REACH. So very quickly, this is what I told you. The intentionally added microplastics has been adopted. This restriction, skin sensitizers, it's being considered. It's a very complicated topic. The new restrictions on PFAS, those are almost they will be adopted soon. They are being final draft is being considered now. Next slide. I told you there's a pillar specifically for consumers. So there we have a directive already adopted, which is the Empowering Consumers Directive. It's the base for all our other consumer-specific legislation that we are introducing. Essentially, it frames what general environmental claims are. It bans general environmental claims when they are not substantiated by a very, very high excellent performance. So normally you will not be able to say that either your product, your services, or your organization is good for the environment or is neutral on the environment unless you have a level of excellence. Then there's also an initiative called the right to repair, meant to boost repair services. For textiles, you do not have an obligation to repair. Economic operators do not have an obligation to repair. This can come under eco-design, but we are considering this. It's no decision yet. And then we have green claims. It's a big initiative. It's in co-decision now. There, the idea is really to require that any environmental claims, so not only the general ones, but any environmental claims, so stating that your product, your service, or your organization is either beneficial for the environment or neutral on the environment, you need to substantiate this um, with a standard that actually measures this and attests this to be true. So this is essentially what green claims does. Just a word of caution, it's the source of much confusion. Green claims does not apply in fields where there's other harmonized legislation, and the example being eco-design. So whenever we have eco-design specifically characterizing textile products in terms of sustainability and circularity, green claims does not apply. And as I told you, we're also revising the eco label to make it align with eco design and much more easy to use than it is currently. Next slide. On waste, we are very excited about this proposal. It's now in co-decision. We are introducing extended producer responsibility schemes. I know, for example, in Italy, you already have some attempts, some experiences, I think at the local level or regional level. We are introducing now EU legislation to in a way harmonize this and make this mandatory all over Europe. An extended producer responsibility scheme is essentially an application of the principle of the polluter pays, and it requires producers of textiles when they place products on the market to pay for the cost of at the end of life that same product being properly managed. And then, of course, introduces rules largely through implementing legislation on how properly to manage, sort, and then manage these products. We are thinking targets is a big issue. We are considering whether to introduce targets. For the moment, there are no targets. Another big issue is EU level concepts of what is waste and what are used textiles that you can reuse. We are working on this as well. Next slide. Then I told you also there's a global pillar to the actions we are pursuing. Here, the big one is indeed what I told you, the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. So this is a directive that forces corporate groups, also for textiles, to to implement internal due diligence procedures to ensure that they are sustainable. Their all operations are sustainable, not only in environmental aspects but also in social aspects. And there's also the forced labor regulation, which is almost adopted, that will prohibit the placing on the market of products made by forced labor. Apart from that, we have a very offensive, in a good way, trade policy that aims to set a minimum all over the world in relation to environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And we also have some waste legislation to avoid exports of waste from the EU, so to keep it here and to be properly managed under our rules. Next slide. All right, so for this to become a reality, of course, not just law in books, but law in action, we need enabling conditions. So first and foremost, of course, still via the legislation, we have enforcement legislation. We have a new market surveillance, it's not so new anymore, but it's from 2019, but we have a new market surveillance regulation. It boosts cross-border cooperation. It has an approach on I'm listening listening to myself. It's a bit distracting. If you can solve that. Um, it has an approach on having a risk assessment to avoid to go after the cases where most infringements occur. We have a regulation introducing an IT tool that we link to the passport I told you about, so that products, when they come to the EU from outside, they are linked to the passport and to the customs IT system. And we are proposing the biggest revision of custom code ever made. And there, the main aspect is really a new approach on e-commerce, because, as you know, we have a lot of products coming directly to end users via the post from e-commerce platforms located outside the EU. We are also doing some work on counterfeiting. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a visual depiction of almost everything we're doing and the interplays between it. I will not go through it. It's for you to look at later. It's a bit complex, but it may serve up the point of explaining a bit more clearly. Next slide. All right, there are other enabling conditions which are not exactly legislative. So first of all, financing. Of course, we have a number of financing modules that companies can apply to help them become more sustainable and more circular, and not only on skills, but also on developing new products, new fibers, new fabrics, new designs. And then we have some soft law initiatives, so for example outreach campaigns and the transition pathway. Next slide, I'll explain what it is. Next slide. So here in this slide and the next, you can pass to the next. Already you have some basic information on the EU funding that's available. It's also for you to look at later if you're interested. Next slide. Okay, next slide. These are all the fundings, so you can look at this later. Let's not dwell on it. Next slide. Okay, this is the campaigns, an example of campaigns that we are having now, on trying to persuade also companies, but essentially consumers, to change their practices. In the case of consumers, purchasing practices. So it was called Refashion Now. Fast fashion is out of fashion. It's trying to make consumers to buy less clothes when they buy too many, but also more sustainable clothes. And of course, eco design will play a key role, and textile labeling, in conveying just how sustainable and circular clothes are, so that then consumers can make their choice. Next slide. The transition pathway I told you about. So what is it? It's a co-creation exercise. So it's the whole industry coming together, also with member states and with us, trying to come up with actions, a list of relevant actions to make the textile sector more digital and greener, above and beyond the regulatory minimum. So of course we'll have a regulatory minimum, but we want companies to go above and beyond in the EU. So we have the list of actions already. It was already published. And now what we're doing as of June last year, so a year now, we are calling for commitments and pledges. So we're calling for companies to come to us and explain to us, and then to everybody, because we published this, what they're doing above and beyond the minimum. And this will also serve as an example of best practices for others to follow. And there's also some explanation on all the financing opportunities. I think this is it. Next slide. I think it's over. Yes. So essentially, the idea is what? It's to make the EU the early mover. I mean, we are the first jurisdiction to really move on sustainable and circular textiles. We want the rest of the world to follow. They will have to follow if they want to keep the EU market in terms of product production, of course, but we want them to follow also in other examples, such as waste management and other issues. And also there's a competitiveness angle to it. So the idea is that by moving early, our industry will prepare. Actually, we will reshore some industry that has moved elsewhere, industry with a higher value added, where we really have uh, best practices also in terms of quality jobs, of higher quality products, such as design. For example, everybody knows Italy is a great example of the luxury textile sector that we have. So we hope to expand this great example to all the textile sector. And the other idea in relation to competitiveness, beyond being an early mover and being prepared for the future, sustainable and green future, is also to reduce our strategic dependence. So if we have a secondary raw materials market from all the waste management and for all the requirements on eco design, we will then not rely on third countries to supply virgin raw materials. We'll have them as secondary raw materials. So this is, in a very quick presentation, the gist of it, the gist of the textile strategy. This is what we're working on, and I don't know if you now have questions or not, but it was a pleasure.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you so
Grazie.
much. You touched a lot of points, and so we thank you very much for your presentation and for joining us. Grazie, grazie ad Antonio De Sousa Maia.